Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar today. My name is Thea Lee. I am president of the Economic Policy Institute, and we are delighted to host today's webinar, which is going to be both illuminating and exciting. We have, hold on, there we go. We are honored to be joined by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson, authors of Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Jacob teaches political science at Yale and is a longtime friend and valued member of EPI's board of directors. We have been fortunate to partner with him over many years, including when he developed the idea that became the public option in the Affordable Care Act debate. Paul Pierson is a political scientist at UC Berkeley. Together, Jacob and Paul have been a formidable team, co-authoring 3 previous books together, all delving into the mysteries and paradoxes of American politics. We are also fortunate to be joined today by 2 stellar panelists: Jaimie Worker, lead state policy analyst for EPI and the Economic Analysis and Research Network, EARN, and Larry Mishel, well known to many of you for his decades of research and leadership as former president and research director of EPI, now a distinguished EPI senior fellow. I am personally grateful to Larry for the strong foundation he built at EPI and the great work that he continues to do. Let Them Eat Tweets is a terrific read, and I recommend it to all of you. You should all go out and buy the book, where you can do it while you're watching. It takes on and illuminates many interesting concepts that you'll hear more about in the next the next hour and a half: plutocratic populism, the threat to majoritarian democracy, and the weaponization of racial division. And not just in the Trump era, but in the decades leading up to it. Sometimes I feel like we are watching a glitzy Las Vegas magic show, complete with puffs of smoke, glitter confetti, beautiful women in skimpy, shiny outfits, and flocks of doves, all while the entire audience's wallets are being systematically taken out of their pockets. This is, I think, the picture that Jacob and Paul have painted for us in terms of the distractions that happen while the economy has been systematically taken in a particular direction. With that, I am delighted to turn over the floor to Jacob and Paul, so they can tell us more about their book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Thea. And thanks to the Economic Policy Institute. I've indeed known it for a long time and learned an enormous amount from my time with it. In fact, as I'll say in a moment, a lot of the core arguments of our book are backed up with some of the data and arguments that the Economic Policy Institute has been developing over the last 25 years. And I just want to thank Larry, who's developed a lot of those arguments and who's here to discuss the book with us. I'm really glad Jaimie can join us. She has the best name for anyone working at the EPI. and I also want to thank the team that's made this webcast possible. It's really wonderful to be able to do these events online. You know, we've actually had quite a few online sort of meetings and discussions around the book, and it's probably one of the few, or silver linings of the very dark cloud that we're living in, that you can have these kinds of conversations across space. And it reminds me, there's this old adage about books, the publication of books, that the period before a book comes out is the calm before the calm. And we've been really lucky that the calm that we've experienced is we're very lucky in that we've been able to have a long conversation about this book. And also, I have to say that in this particular context, a little bit of calm would actually be a nice thing, but we've definitely not had that. So as Thea was saying, there's sort of 2 levels of distraction that we need to be aware of. And the title of the book, Let Them Eat Tweets, is talking about one of those levels of distraction, about the way in which this kind of outrage politics that is so personified by Donald Trump, and especially today, is is a distraction from the fundamental issues that are affecting ordinary Americans, and especially magnified during this COVID crisis. But there's another level of distraction, which is that we have focused so much on Donald Trump and not enough at the reasons why he's in office and why his party has become what it has become. As Thea pointed out, we say that the Republican Party has become a party of plutocratic populism, a kind of marriage of organized money and organized outrage. And this bitter brew of reactionary economic priorities and right-wing racial and cultural appeals predates Donald Trump by a fair amount. We really look back at the sort of thinking of Republicans in the 1980s about the kind of alliance they wanted to build. We have a memo from Lee Atwater discussing this. And we also talk about how Newt Gingrich really brought together the organized money and organized outrage for the first time in a kind of effective way within the GOP coalition in the 1990s. But in fact, we think that there's roots, or there's a picture of this plutocratic populism that forms within the GOP that goes back, that you can see even further back in time. And one of the important sort of inspirations for the book was the work of the political scientist Daniel Ziblatt on the rise of democracy in Europe. And he points out that in the early 20th century, conservative parties were really where the kind of tensions between inequality and democracy were most manifest and apparent. And so when the franchise was expanded, conservative parties faced what he called a conservative dilemma. They had to decide whether or not they were going to side with the rich and the propertied, the people who had supported them and who were they were most closely allied with, or side with, or at least make overtures toward the workers who were being newly enfranchised. And how conservative parties responded to this dilemma really shaped the course of democracy in these countries, and determined whether or not they successfully made the transition from elite bastions. These parties made the transition from elite bastions to modern, functional democratic parties. Well, the Republican Party is kind of making a reverse transition, right? It's become, as inequality has risen in the United States, as the party that has traditionally been allied with those at the top, it's been facing the same conservative dilemma. And it's had to decide, or its leaders have had to grapple with the question of whether it will be an elite bastion or whether it will find a way to respond to rising inequality that allows it to be a functioning democratic party that doesn't have to resort to outrage stoking or to vote rigging to stay in power. And alas, as we show, the Republican Party has not taken the happy route toward economic moderation and multiracial politics. Instead, it has embraced an increasingly extreme economic agenda on the one hand, and resorted to ever more extreme appeals to racial and cultural backlash on the other. Now, I'm going to hand off to Paul in just a minute, but I want to really emphasize the ways in which our thinking was inspired by what the Economic Policy Institute's work has unearthed. I think too often we forget that the United States has experienced a world historical increase in inequality, one that is far greater, far more concentrated at the top, far more destructive of the power of workers than the increases in inequality that we've seen in other advanced industrial democracies. I won't go into statistics. The Economic Policy Institute has provided them again and again, but I want to really emphasize a point that Larry has emphasized as well. Politics and this rise in inequality are not two separate stories. The way in which our political leaders have responded to and influenced inequality and intensified it is really at the heart of our story. And while we're going to talk about, we hope we're going to talk about the way in which the Democratic Party was affected. This book is really about how the Republican Party was set down this destructive path by this world historical shift. So, Paul, why don't you tell us a little more about the book?
Sure. Thanks, Jacob. I want to thank everybody at EPI, echoing Jacob's remarks, for putting this event together, which we're very grateful for, and we're looking forward to the discussion, but more broadly for the work that you do, which is so vital at this moment, but has really shaped our thinking and motivated the work in this book. Because we were struck when we first got the idea that we were going to write this by the ways in which intense inequality had sort of dropped out of the conversation about what was happening to American politics. And some of that is for good, understandable reasons, because of Trump's larger than life presence, and because of the fact that it has brought racial cleavages in particular so much to the fore in the United States. And I know we're going to try to talk quite a bit about that today. And I'll say a little bit about this just in my opening comments. But it is striking, we think, the extent to which these issues of profound economic inequality, and of course, Jacob is right, that this is not something that's happening throughout the world of affluent democracies in anything like the same way. It is a distinctively American story that so much of the gains in the economy are concentrated in the hands of so few. And it really does call out for an explanation how that can happen in a country that professes to be a democracy and in which ordinary voters do have an important say in what happens in politics. So we were surprised by the way in which this seemed to be dropping out of the discussion. And one way in which that manifests itself is a kind of common narrative about the Republican Party and the Trump administration that you hear, which is that there was kind of a civil war between the Ryan wing of the party, or the establishment wing of the party, as people sometimes call it, and the Trumpist populist wing of the party, and that the establishment wing lost. And you can find, in many ways, useful commentaries by journalists and some academics that basically frame things in this way. But we think that's just a fundamental misreading of what's been going on. And only true could only be a view that one would hold if one didn't really look very closely at what's actually been happening in Washington, what the government has actually been doing. So our chapter on that tension, because there is tension between the plutocrats and the populists, to use that language, our chapter on that is entitled "A Very Civil War." Right. So there is tension, but it's very civil tension, because both sides are getting a lot out of this bargain. Right. They've been able to come together in a coalition that has produced bigger wins for economic elites in American politics than had been true in at least 100 years. Right. So Mitch McConnell, at the end of 2017, Trump's first year in office, describes it as the best year for conservatives across the board in the 30 years that he had been in Washington. And Charles Koch, the leading plutocrat, I would say, in conservative circles over the last few decades, said that the party that his agenda had advanced more in the past few years, in the handful of years since the rise of the Tea Party, than in all the previous time that he had been engaged in politics prior to that, over virtually a half century, right? And they were right to be crowing that way about the gains that they had made. So, if you look at what came out of Congress, the healthcare bill, astonishingly reactionary and unpopular healthcare bill, which ultimately failed, but only by a couple of votes. And then an equally astonishing, or maybe even more astonishing, tax bill, which made the George W. Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 look downright egalitarian. The 2017 tax cuts offered 80% of their permanent benefits, $2 trillion bill, 80% of permanent benefits going to the top 1% of the income distribution. Really just an astonishing thing for a major party in a democracy to do. And as we show in the book, extremely unpopular, not popular even with Republican voters. But the wins didn't stop there. Huge wins in the way the administration pursued domestic policy initiatives. Donald Trump, not interested in policy, hands over responsibility for personnel largely to Mike Pence. Mike Pence, a very close ally with the Koch brothers network, and populates the administration. The EPA is a classic example of this that we pursue, but it's true in many other agencies as well. The administration is populated by lobbyists and people involved in these plutocratic networks who are pursuing that kind of agenda. And then lastly, and something that we think is too often overlooked, but in many ways is very revealing about the nature of this contemporary alliance, the courts, and the Supreme Court in particular. And people often frame discussions of the courts as involving, this is the concession to the social conservatives. This is what white evangelicals get out of the deal. And they certainly do get a lot out of the deal. The Supreme Court is very important to them, very important to the National Rifle Association, another group that we pay quite a bit of attention to in the book. But the plutocrats are at least as happy with these conservative Supreme Court appointments. And that part of the story is often forgotten. But the Koch brothers, Mitch McConnell, the US Chamber of Commerce, they recognized that they can put staunch economic conservatives, staunchly pro-business jurists on the federal courts and on the Supreme Court in particular, where they have made a series of decisions that that these economic elites have been pushing for decades. Right. So in some ways, what happens on the Supreme Court is the perfect embodiment of this coalition, where the plutocrats have been able to find allies stoked up by a machinery that the Republican Party has built over the past few decades, exploited perfectly by Donald Trump in many ways. The plutocrats have been able to establish an alliance that hands them victories that would have no backing by the American public if put to a vote, or if they had to try to do it through Congress. Their agenda is profoundly unpopular, and thus it takes a particular kind of machinery, a machinery that we think has been quite dangerous for American democracy and for broad prosperity to make this happen. And I think I'll just, because I want to keep the conversation moving, bring in the other panelists and get to a point as early as we can to take questions from all the people who are joining this conversation. I'll just mention, and I'm sure we're going to come back and talk about this more, that another major dimension of this book is really to think about how the economic dimension of popular distress and the cultural dimension of popular distress fit together. Many people have presented this as a kind of contest between, is it economic anxiety or is it racial resentment? And we started this book, I think, feeling quite humbled about this issue because we recognized that in our prior work, we had really underestimated the centrality of racial cleavages and racial resentments of this kind to the motor forces of the Republican Party. We were, like many, surprised and shocked to learn that a kind of openly George Wallace bullhorn rather than dog whistle version of racialized politics could succeed in the United States in the 21st century. So we've spent a lot of time wrestling with that book and trying to think about it in a deeper and more satisfactory way. But we do want to emphasize two things that I think come out of our focus on the economic inequalities that have emerged in the US over the last 40 years or so. One is that in order to understand why this racial resentment has become so powerful in our politics, one has to think about how economic inequality has fueled powerful interests who have an incentive, elite interests who have an incentive to try to generate these kinds of sentiments, and make them the central dimension in which politics is fought in a highly, highly economically unequal society. And then the second thing is to think about how that transformation works at the popular level, to think about how it's not either racial resentment or economic anxiety, but a complicated dynamic that we try to explore in the book, in which Republicans have been extremely successful in sort of transmuting economic challenges, stresses, inequalities into this particular kind of racial manifestation that we've been witnessing. So I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm sure that just begins to scratch the surface of something that hopefully we'll now have a chance to talk about more.
Thank you so much, Jacob and Paul, for those great and very provocative opening comments. I think there's a lot to think about here, and I do love the way that you all bring together the economic and the cultural and the political into a single thread of conversation. Our first discussant is Larry Mishel, former president of EPI and currently a distinguished senior fellow at EPI. Larry.
Thank you very much. First, thanks for motivating me to get into a button-down shirt. And secondly, thank you for the kind comments from Thea and Jacob. Let me point out, it takes a village, it takes a whole institute. Do this by just naming two of the books by my colleague, Josh Bivens. One in 2010 was called Failure by Design, which was articulated that the bad outcomes were not an accident. It wasn't a broken economy. It was how it was designed to occur. And then there was one on globalization, which was everybody wins except for most of us. So great titles, and it just reflects our work. And it is true that our work is the flip side of your work. We show how the economy is rigged, and you show how the riggers get away with it politically. And so let's jump to a little deeper on what Paul ended with. And that is this whole issue of race and economic anxiety. We had kind of an insipid debate for a lot of years, which it's either all race or it's either economic anxiety. And you do acknowledge that you missed the boat somewhat in earlier books on race. Be useful to say what you think you missed a little bit more. And secondly, I'd like you to explore more about how you see what we call wage suppression and wage inequality, shaping the politics of the working class. And I'm not just saying the white working class, I'm just the working class, period.
Well, let me start off and say just a word. Let me just start by saying a little bit about wage suppression, because it's not something that we spend a lot of time on in the book. In our prior work, especially the book Winner Take All Politics we published in 2010, we focused much more on how the imbalance of power between labor and capital has worked. And I do want to say that, I mean, ultimately, when we talk about inequality, we're talking about an imbalance of power, not just an imbalance of economic resources. The book talks about there being a kind of triple threat that happens when inequality rises. One of the threats is that the wealthy have more resources and influence, but in addition, the wealthy become more and more have a more and more distinct set of interests from the middle and working classes, and they become more disdainful of democracy. And so I think if you look at the patterns of wage suppression, you really see the ways in which both the greater power and the distinctive interests operate at the level of individual workers and workplaces. And I'll just say that the decline of labor unions is such a fundamental story here, and one that we think operates not just at that workplace level, but really more broadly within our democracy. And it links up actually, and now I'll come back to race with the racial point, because labor unions have a dark history when it comes to race, but as Eric Schickler has shown in his work, as the New Deal coalition evolved, there actually was a pretty effective alliance of labor and the civil rights movement. And after the civil rights movement, labor unions became really fundamental to democratic electoral success, in particular by forging this coalition of minority and white labor voters. And so in 2008, the most important factor in whether a working class white American would vote for Barack Obama was whether or not they're a member of a labor union, right? So labor unions play this critical role. So with regard to race, I'm not going to say much. I'm going to let Paul take that mostly, except for to just say that a little bit about how we underestimated it in the past. So in our prior work, I think we focused a lot on the way in which the organized interests, like the Koch network, like the Chamber of Commerce, like the American Legislative Exchange Council, these organizations that became very effective at using money to influence politics, how they reshaped the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but particularly the Republican Party. We focus less on this question of, well, how is that possible in a democracy where the positions that these groups are taking are deeply unpopular? Now, we said some things, but I think, and we did, of course, talk about race, but I think we just didn't grapple sufficiently with the ways in which race became this central part of the Republican strategy for marrying these plutocratic economic priorities with a winning electoral strategy. And so Paul can say a bit more about that.
Well, I think what I'd like to do at this point is to introduce a central part of our answer to this question, which, and in some ways it plays nicely off of what Jacob just said about labor unions, right? So labor unions have played an absolutely fundamental role in sort of mediating between ordinary citizens, members of unions and their families, and those people's sort of understandings of the world around them, right? What they see as being most important, what they see as being in danger, who they think their friends are, and who they think their enemies are. And we think that that's more broadly true and often missed in these conversations. So after 2016, after the election, it seems like every journalist in the country decided that they had to go to bars or diners in the heartland to find out how these, white working class Trump voters felt about the world. And not that I think that there was anything wrong with doing that, but we think that's actually not the best way to get a handle on what had happened, right? So I'll give you a couple of quick examples that don't ostensibly have anything to do with race, all right? So if you ask white evangelicals today whether Muslims or Christians face more discrimination in the United States, most white evangelicals will say Christians face more discrimination than Muslims do, right? Or if you ask members of the NRA what their view is about background checks, most of them believe that a lot of what gun advocates would call common sense gun reforms, most NRA supporters actually support those policies. But when the issue is framed as the NRA does, as what's more important to you, gun regulation or protecting your Second Amendment rights, they're very open to this whole idea that there's like a slippery slope, and that basically if you do anything to regulate guns in any way, you're one step away from the gulag. Right. So, and again, as with white evangelicals who think Muslims are less discriminated against in the US than Christians are, we don't think that they woke up one morning with those views and suddenly just saw the world that way. We think that there was an organized effort over decades to try to mobilize that kind of political identity. And as we explore in the book, this happens over decades within the Republican Party, in which a Republican Party increasingly embracing the plutocrats and seeking some way to mobilize voters, joins hands with what we call surrogate groups, who are really good at stoking what now looks like white identity, right? And as we argue in the book, it's always had a really racialized element to it, even though that was often a lot quieter than it is today, right? So if you go back to the early days of the Christian right, or go back to the history of the NRA, you will see this, right? That race is right there in driving the development of these organizations. And then the third set of outrage stokers that we talk about in the book, which we think, even though it's unorthodox in some ways to put it next to the NRA or the Christian right, is right-wing media, right? So right-wing media has been very good at generating outrage and fear and stoking this kind of white identity in a similar way. So we think that when you think about how economic anxiety and racial resentment are stitched together, that a really, really important part of the story is that there has been this kind of organized effort to make the Republican Party and its electorate safe for the plutocrats, right? By building up these relationships with these very extreme groups, right? That thrive on generating outrage and a sense of threat, but direct that outrage and sense of threat not towards the people who are imposing economic harms on those communities, right? But at a whole set of other kinds of actors.
Great,
Okay.
thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah, do another quick question, Larry, and then we'll go to
Okay.
James.
So just a suggestion, one way to illustrate your point about the very Civil War. I can never forget Trump's April 2016 speech in Pittsburgh on trade, where he cited EPI 18 times in footnotes and presented himself as a savior for the working class. When he got around to say what to do, it was a full-on Chamber of Commerce agenda of tax cuts for the rich and corporations and deregulation. So it was a total, bait and switch. So it's a good way to illustrate that. But let's talk about one of my favorite topics, the Democrats. So, I've been someone who's beaten my head against that wall for several decades and found that very popular things that we wish the Democrats to pursue on behalf of workers never seem to come easy to get them to do. And in fact, in some ways, I think they turned a blind eye to much of the problems of the working class. They may have attention to low-income people and poor, but not to the working class. So you say that the world is not black hats and white hats, black hats being GOP and white hats being Democrats. The Democrats have gray hats. So explain to us, because you don't do it so much in the book, what are the mechanisms by which money, the plutocrats, the corporations, shape Democrats and how they pursue their policy agenda? And how can the progressives, pro-working class forces overcome that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Larry. And, that line that we use, the Democrats, it's not black and white hats, it's black and gray hats is a big focus of winner take all politics, the book we wrote in 2010, where we also kind of show that the Republican Party is often kind of at the forefront of pushing for these hugely inegalitarian changes, but Democrats are often the enablers. And when we say Democrats, it is important to understand there are tensions and divisions within the party, and that one of the things that I always want to emphasize is the ways in which both the inherent structure of our constitutional system and the ways in which Republicans have undermined it have made it really, really hard to govern, and it magnified the power of the more conservative voices within the Democratic Party. I just want to emphasize that, right? If you have to get 60 votes because of the filibuster on everything, then, going back to 2009, then folks like Ben Nelson get to decide what a good healthcare plan is, right? I remember that all very, very well. So
And Joe Lieberman.
And Joe, yeah, I didn't even want to mention him. Since when the public option went down because Joe Lieberman's opposition, he actually told the New York Times that he was against some kind of compromise because I was for it, which made me feel like weirdly good, because Joe Lieberman knew who I was. Also made me feel like I should have been against some other things like the Iraq War, so that Joe, or been for some other things like the Iraq War, so Joe Lieberman would be against them. So, but seriously, the role of money is really profound, and people, I think, underestimate it for two reasons. I mean, one is that they tend to focus on donations, and donations are, really skewed. 10% of all campaign donations in 1980 came from the top 0.01% of donors. In 2018, half of all donations came from the top 0.01% of donors. But it's all the other stuff, lobbying, hidden money, the organizations that get created. Those are really profoundly important. And a lot of times what they're trying to do is I was just talking about, to tie government up in knots. And so the Democrats have definitely been cross-pressured by the increased role of money in politics. And I think those cross pressures still exist within the party, and they exist even when Democrats, when Democrats have their own plutocrats. Because if you look, we really make a point about this. Even the most plutocrats who are most progressive, if you will, on social issues and totally against many of Donald Trump's policies and with regard to trade and immigration, even those plutocrats wanted the 2017 tax cuts, are very skeptical of labor unions, often very skeptical of government regulation. And so you've got a problem. The one party's rich people seem to be complete, and the plutocratic choir as a whole sings with a heavily conservative accent. It leans very far right, but one party's rich people, the Republican Party's rich people, knows it wants a government that serves them and is willing to tolerate or even encourage the kind of racial backlash you're talking about. The other party's rich people kind of wants some of those same things too. And to the extent that they're pushing back within the Democratic Party, they're not as focused on economic issues. They're focused on issues of identity and social issues. So I think it's a real issue. And I'll see if Paul wants to jump in at all.
I always have more to say, but I think it'd be good to keep getting more voices in here. So maybe would go on to Jaimie's question.
Jaimie Worker. Earn state policy.
Hi. Thanks again. Thanks so much, Paul and Jacob, for your work. I wanted to focus specifically on state level policies and the implications for politics at the state level in particular. One of the things that you noted in your book is birth of the Heritage Foundation, the formation of the American Legislative Council, and also the increasingly narrow focus of the Chamber of Commerce on undermining the power of workers, environmental protections, as well as voter rights. And all of this while positioning people of color as a threat and government as corrupt and ineffective. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about your exploration of this in your book and also the implications of this for state level policies and politics.
That's great, thanks. So maybe I'll say a little bit about these organized actors and let Jacob talk a little bit about how this is playing out in the States and particularly at this moment. So we do think, I think central to our basic way of thinking about American politics is that organized power really, really matters, especially when you're interested in focusing on governance. And that often we think discussions get sidetracked, and the media, I think, often plays a role in this because they think policy is kind of boring and complicated. And elections are more like sports events, right? So they can cover them like the Super Bowl, that's just, you can talk about whether the red team is up or whether the blue team is up. And so that attracts a lot of attention. But if you care about what government does, and we believe strongly that everybody needs to care about what government does because it makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, we can see this, you couldn't see it more starkly than the way that we see it now, where there's been such a spectacular government failure, not in all countries, in this country, spectacular failure to deal with the pandemic, just a complete, I think, collapse of governance at the federal level. It's really quite astonishing that we see the governance really matters, and these organized groups are relentlessly focused on trying to tilt governance in their direction, right? And so here again, and this is, I think, again, a really important theme that EPI has developed, the sharp decline in the strength of labor unions in American society, right, has just had a profound effect on the balance of organized power around economic issues in the United States, right? I mean, unions matter enormously for the individuals who are members of that union, but they also matter enormously for the broader quality of political life and political governance. And in general, we think the evidence, both in the US and cross-nationally, is very clear that countries that have stronger unions do a much better job of taking care of the economic and social needs of ordinary citizens. So the decline of unions is just a huge deal in shifting the balance of power within American society and within American politics. And of course, the flip side of that has been the intense mobilization on the side of organized business and the wealthy, right? Somewhat distinct, right? So you have things like, maybe you could say that the clearest examples of that. So for organized business, it's the US Chamber of Commerce. The evolution of the Chamber of Commerce, we actually chronicle a lot in the book that came in between Winner Take All Politics and this book, American Amnesia, which, and I think the transformation of the Chamber since the 1990s from a conservative organization, but an organization that could work with both parties and that was right, for example, I mean, a real turning point is that it was right on the edge of endorsing the Clinton healthcare plan, right, back in 1993. And there was a coup, in part organized by people like John Boehner, right, who wanted to push the Republican Party in a more extreme direction and wanted to bring business with us. There was a coup orchestrated in many ways by right-wing Republicans to shift the Chamber of Commerce in a very different direction. And the Chamber has become, in the 25 years since then, much more powerful organization, a much more right-wing organization with a more extreme and narrow economic agenda. It basically sells its services, one at a time to the pharmaceutical industry, and then to the fossil fuel industry, and then to Wall Street to do their bidding, right, in Washington, and to serve the very biggest corporations. And that has also involved a much deeper alliance with the Republican Party, right? So the Chamber used to give money to people in both parties and used to work on bipartisan legislation. And now they do everything in their power. And they, their staff has, it's basically a revolving door with the Republican Party and the Republican National Committee. And their advisors will openly talk about their ticket, right? Our ticket, the Chamber's ticket, is the Republican senatorial ticket, right? So that's a really extraordinary change of a very, very powerful organization in a way that has helped transform the character of American governance. And maybe Jacob, you could say something about how this plays out in the States.
Well, yes, and first let me just explain why it's suddenly a lot darker in my room. We just had a power outage, and I'm very fortunate to have been doing this on a laptop. So I've been able to switch over immediately to this. But I'm sure what Paul said was brilliant, but forgive me if I end up repeating a little bit of it. So First, let me just recommend a wonderful book by someone who also has done work for EPI, Alex Hurdle-Fernandez, which is really about the way in which these plutocratic organizations have worked at the state level. And there really is an interesting story about how these groups like the Chamber of Commerce have, they've invested in every new frontier of influence, including the Supreme Court, in the courts, and attorney general's races, state attorney general's races, and influencing, of course, state legislatures. And it's just, having that kind of resources really matters. I mean, just one illustration is that there's, Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society runs this judicial crisis network, which gets these ultra-conservative justices and judges onto the federal courts and the Supreme Court. And when Kavanaugh was being considered, there was a single donation of $16 million that was given to JCN. So just saying, that's a lot of money, and that kind of money plays out at every level of our politics. So, I mean, the state level story pretty well, Jaimie. So I will just say that it's really clear that Republicans understand that they're pursuing an agenda that requires that they build up a kind of bulwark against popular majorities, right? We just saw in Missouri that, when you put it to a vote, Medicaid expansion is popular, right? But if you can engage in various forms of extreme partisan gerrymandering so that you have outsized majorities in the state house, if you can engage in voter suppression efforts, right, that mean that it's much harder for voters, particularly voters of color, to hold you accountable. And importantly, if you can try to invest in locking in policies, then you can really sort of pursue a kind of counter-majoritarian strategy. And that's what we talk about in the book. And so note that when Republicans gain power at the state houses, particularly in states that are more contested, like Wisconsin, they slash taxes to undermine the capacity of government. They pursue right to work so that labor unions are weakened. They try to weaken public sector labor unions as well, right? And they pursue all these forms of vote rigging, right, that cement their majorities. And so we're seeing that same kind of counter-majoritarian stuff play out at both the state and the national levels. And it's really, to us, the greatest risk and fear that comes out of this plutocratic populist party.
Okay, great. Those were some amazing, very deep questions and answers. And thank you so much, Jaimie, and thank you, Larry. We're going to go to some of the questions that we're getting in the Q&A box, and I'm going to actually combine a couple of them that are on similar themes and ask Jacob and Paul, and if Jaimie and Larry want to throw in a few words, that's okay too. So the first one is, what are your suggestions for getting people to be aware that the Republicans are bought and paid for by the billionaire oligarchy, and we won't get legislative progress until they are out? And the writer is particularly concerned about states like Montana, Georgia, and South Carolina, where we have close Senate races that possibly would be winnable if more people were voting around this issue. And then I have a couple others that are sort of related, and that's with all the activism today, are you hopeful that we can turn things around and reclaim our democracy? And the last one is there any possibility now for campaign finance reform? Assuming Democratic control of Congress and presidency, what is the limiting factor? So let me ask Jacob and Paul to weigh in on those sort of big political questions.
Well, let me say just a little bit about the first one. I wish I thought that this was easy. It's a striking thing. It is a striking thing that when voters do pay attention to these kinds of issues, Republicans are in big trouble, right? It is a striking thing, as we chronicle in the book. If you look at all the major pieces of legislation, really major bills that have been passed in the last 30 years or came very close to passage in the last 30 years. The most unpopular one was the Republican healthcare proposal in 2017, right? And the second most unpopular one was the Republican tax cut bill in 2017 and early 2018. It's really quite astonishing. You know, we explore this in the book, you know, that because you just wouldn't expect a party that is, you know, has gotten popularly elected and is going to have to run again to pursue radically unpopular policies like that. But they did it, you know, we call these, you know, as political scientists, we see these as kind of unicorns. Like you really should not expect, you know, might expect them to do a bunch of unpopular stuff on the side, but you wouldn't expect like their flagship legislation to be, you know, spectacularly unpopular. But both these bills were, right. And so then it turns out that in 2018, when, as we chronicled this in Let Them Be Tweets, that when Republicans are trying to gear up for the 2018 campaign, and they begin by saying, oh, you know, we're going to talk about our tax cuts, and they pretty quickly figure out they run focus groups and pollsters, and even their big, you know, plutocratic donors are saying, you guys don't want to do this. Like you're not going to be able to run on this record, right? So they start talking about, if you remember, they start talking about like the caravan, right? It's all red meat on the kind of social and cultural issues that becomes part of their campaign, though unsuccessful, right? So
Paul,
yeah.
I wanted to jump in right there with something that's very relevant to today's political debate, which is the Republicans' failure to extend unemployment insurance, the extended $600 a week payment. Again, you know, you're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis of massive proportions, and the Republicans are holding up that bill around liability for corporations and so on. So just in your panoply of super unpopular and seemingly strange political choices, let's throw that into the mix as well.
You're so right, Thea, and in fact, we actually had a piece in the New York Times about a month or so ago where we framed it exactly like what's up with this party that is about to face re-election. They continue to do that, you know, super unpopular stuff and stake out super unpopular positions. It really, I think, is very telling, right, about how entrenched these interests are. But of course, most voters are not paying that much attention to this stuff. I mean, it's just a reality that it is very difficult to get voters to really focus on policy most of the time. But I would say, you know, in terms of my thinking about how to change this, the single biggest thing I would say is that if Democrats are successful in gaining power after November, and of course there's a lot of issues to be discussed before we get to that point, I think it is absolutely critical, and I think it would be very good politics for them to be pretty aggressive about pursuing policies that are going to be highly visible to ordinary Americans, that can draw on the kinds of financial resources that are potentially available through taxes, right? To redistribute from the huge, the very narrow winner circle that has had huge winnings over the past generation. And I'll just give one example to give you an idea. And of course, this is actually prominent in all the platforms of the leading Democratic candidates to one degree or another. But if you were just to roll back the estate tax provisions to what they were before George W. Bush came into office, forget about going back to the 1980s, but just to when George W. Bush came into office, that could generate something like $160 billion a year in revenue, just the estate tax, right? You know, you can do a lot of things that would make people see that there's a real difference between the parties if you were to pursue initiatives like that.
Yeah, and I would also say, and this is to respond to that really excellent question too, that political reform should really be at the forefront of the Republicans' agenda. No, the forefront of the Democrats' agenda. And that leads to the question around campaign finance reform. And I mean, the important thing to say is that, yes, voters don't understand a lot of these issues particularly well. Yes, they're not always paying attention, but it is encouraging, right? These are massively unpopular policies, right? It's Republicans, we argue, are in a race against time, right? They're in a race against time because they're on the wrong side of the two great dramatic developments of the last generation, namely the growing diversity of our nation and the rise of this kind of winner-take-all inequality. And these are not, their positions, by the way, with regard to both race and, as we've seen in the context of the protests, and economic issues are not majority positions. And that's why the biases in the political system, both those that are inherent and those that they've created, are so fundamental. So, you know, the money in politics is actually one of those sources of bias. And of course, it is reflective of another, namely the fact that the Supreme Court has been stacked with conservative justices. You know, and that in turn reflects another bias that we don't talk enough about, which is that the Senate is vastly malapportioned in a way that matters a lot. It didn't used to matter nearly as much, but now because rural places are much more Republican, the Senate's rural bias, its bias towards low population states, is also a Republican bias. And so think about the Kavanaugh nomination I mentioned earlier. Kavanaugh was confirmed by senators representing 40%, 44% of the American population, right? And of course, he's now going to be pivotal to protecting the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision that unleashed a lot of the more recent manifestations, extreme manifestations of money in politics. That said, I do think that we can address money in politics even with the current Supreme Court. And I would say that there's two things that are fundamental. One is to figure out how to empower smaller donors. And this is a widely recognized position. It's also, it looks to be consistent with Supreme Court, even the Supreme Court's conservative jurisprudence. So empowering small donors is a counterweight to the big donors. And then the second thing that is consistent is to try to, really increase the influence of the other major political resource that ordinary people have, not money, but votes, right? We must broaden our system with automatic registration, with measures that make it impossible to engage in the kind of voter suppression efforts that we've seen, with other measures that were talked about by none other than Barack Obama at John Lewis's funeral. So I would just be really focused on these two big things. One, pushing back against extreme inequality with popular visible measures of the sort that Paul discussed, and putting in place some important political reforms that allow you to get to a better, a more virtuous circle. And ultimately, this race against time point means that if we can hold our democracy together, the longer term picture is actually much more optimistic. We're really facing this period in which the question is whether democracy will remain vibrant as we try to grapple with the transformation of our society.
Great. I'm going to hold on to that ray of hope. I think we're going to need you all to paint us a picture of how we get out of this. I have another question from the chat, from the Q&A box, and this one's a little bit different. It's a little bit broader, but I think you folks can handle it. So the question is, couldn't our political situation be explained by patriarchy? White men over men of color and all men over all women. That this dynamic explains the open aggression on the basis of race and also towards women and towards men who don't conform to the latest permutation of the status quo. So you've done a lot more on race than on gender, but maybe you can wrap that in.
Well, Paul's not unmuted himself. Do you want to jump in, Paul?
Well, yeah, I was waiting to see whether you wanted to, but because so one thing, let me say a couple of things about it. One that I think would be sympathetic to that question. I mean, I don't think that we're inclined to believe that there is one true cause. We try to pull, as I think you were saying earlier, Thea, that part of what we're trying to do here really is to weave together what we see as a bunch of central elements and to show how together they generate much of what we see in the political world today. But there's no question that gender is an important part of that. And I think the clearest piece of evidence for that is to see that there is now a very large and growing gender gap in the vote for the two political parties. I mean, as the Republican Party has taken this turn towards Trumpism. He actually has been hemorrhaging white voters, but in particular white women voters. And I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah, and I would just add, there's a huge gender gap in the representation of women within the parties and at the elite level. So, if you look at if you compare the Republicans caucus in the House and Senate with the Democrats caucus, particularly in the House, I mean, there's just no question that the Republican Party is having a hard time sort of developing a broader agenda that can appeal to a broad cross-section of Americans. And I do think that this kind of links to a point we make in the book that I just want to mention briefly, which is that we tend to think of, we tend to want to kind of come down and say that there's just this like one cleavage that Republicans have exploited. It's all about their ability to exploit race, the black-white divide. But of course, they also were able to exploit the brown-white divide. And they also have become increasingly, aligned with a kind of, rural, white male identity. There's a great quote from Lindsey Graham that he says, we're not creating enough. In 2012, he said, we're not producing enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term. And so the identity, the alignment of these identities is not an accident. It's been really fomented by Republicans because they're basically trying to find the formula that will allow them to get as close as possible to electoral majorities in enough places to be able to hold on to power. And as I just said, that's been getting harder and harder. And I want to be optimistic too, because I am optimistic for the long term. It's the short term and medium term that really worries me. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that how fragile and endangered our democratic political institutions are, and work individually and together to try to ensure that this election in the fall is free, fair, and decisive, and also to work afterward to try to reform our institutions that are, as we've seen, very vulnerable to both authoritarian and counter-majoritarian challenges.
Larry?
I just very briefly want to make sure we call attention to, there was a lot of sexism involved in taking down Hillary Clinton. I'm not the biggest Hillary Clinton fan, but you have to acknowledge that she was burdened by that. And we also saw that with Elizabeth Warren. And we also saw that these gender patriarchy issues are very much have to do with a lot of the reproductive rights issues that have really fueled a lot of the politics. So I just want to make sure we bring those things forward in addition to the things that you said.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for those answers. Here's another question, another pivot. How much stock, if any, do you put into the recent rhetorical shift among a subset of GOP office holders? Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley come to mind, and I know you mentioned this in the book, that does acknowledge inequality as a problem and offers the beginning of a quite tepid response. Is this the beginning of an emerging schism within the GOP?
Well, no. I would say no. Talk is cheap, and as the questioner suggested, it's quite tepid. And that's one of the things that I think is central to our analysis is watch what people do, watch the way that they govern, and that will tell you an awful lot about what their real priorities are and whose voices count within the party. So it's kind of like I saw a prominent journalist tweeting today or yesterday saying, I think now Republicans are starting to talk about the deficit and they're concerned about the debt, and I think this time they really mean it, and it's like, why why would you possibly think that? Like, what is it? To me, it's very clear if you actually watch what they do and not what they say, that Republicans have no concern about the deficit, that they only have concern about things that cost money that are priorities of the Democratic Party and not priorities of the Republican Party, right? So the deficit and the debt are rhetorical tools that they use as a cudgel against Democrats when they think that government spending is going to be, or fiscal space, borrowing, is going to be used for things that they don't want, right? So I just see nothing in the track record of the party. Since John McCain, we do talk about the 2000 campaign, and that's interesting. It's kind of the last real moment where a Republican who actually did seem to be more interested in middle-class economics was in a powerful position in the party. But the one slight ray of hope that I would add to that is that, and this echoes something that Jacob said about being an optimist in the long term, right? We do believe that the Republican Party is running out of angry, and I would add old white guys, that's not a viable electoral coalition in a well-functioning democracy over the long term, and that if we can keep American politics from running off the rails, that the Republican Party will be forced to shift its agenda, that it will be forced, we think, both to become a less plutocratic party and to become a more multiracial party, right? And that those things could actually create a kind of virtuous cycle, right? In which, because the more it is forced to become a multiracial party, the more it's going to have to find other ways to appeal to voters, which we think would mean having to reach out towards the middle class and towards working class voters in healthier ways. The challenge, though, is getting to that long run, right? And the danger is, and I think there is lots of evidence, and we chronicle more of it in the book, there is lots of evidence to suggest that many powerful forces within the Republican Party are increasingly comfortable with an alternative path, right? Which is, if you can't appeal to voters, change the system so you don't have to appeal to voters, or at least you don't have to do it in a fair contest.
Jacob?
No, let's get some more questions in the mix.
Okay, great. So I have another one, and this one actually is, is aimed at you, Jacob. Somebody's asking, Jacob, can you please elaborate on your comment that greater accumulation of wealth leads to greater disdain for democracy?
Sure. So the book actually has a fair number of quotes from either super rich people or people who like to pass policies that help super rich people that are basically saying that they don't trust democracy. I mean, the famous Romney 47% argument, right, was a kind of crude version of this that was understating in a lot of ways how challenging it is for Republicans, because in fact, it's vast supermajorities of Americans that would like to tax the rich more and think that the kind of tax cuts and massive slashing of vital regulations and rules that help protect consumers and the environment are bad things. So, when we look back at the history of democracy again and again, we see that when there's a big increase in inequality or a big challenge to entrenched economic elites, that those at the top not only have more power, not only have a distinct set of interests, but they also become much more disdainful of democracy. That was the triple threat I talked about earlier. And you know, that disdain is, you know, given that how much democracy is sort of enshrined in our national ideology, the fact that you've got a lot of plutocrats and their allies who are willing to basically say the quiet part out loud, that they would much rather have a system that wasn't so driven by the public, and particularly the less affluent portions of the public, that is very telling, right? That they would actually say that. And just to be clear, we're not just talking about rhetoric, right? All of those policies I talked about before, right? The vote suppression, extreme partisan gerrymandering, resisting political reforms that would reduce the sway of money in politics. Indeed, supporting justices and judges that will protect the role and expand the role of money in politics. All of those changes are really about, weaponizing, further increasing the role of money in politics and further increasing the power of the super rich. And so I think, we have to understand that what we're talking about, as I said before, is not just a huge, a world historical shift in the distribution of income and wealth in the United States, one that makes us stand out, but also a world historical shift in the distribution of influence, and one that has run powerfully through the Republican Party, and really we think is at the root of a lot of the dysfunction of the contemporary Republican Party, and at the root of its disdain for and attacks on democracy.
Yeah, actually, this is maybe a follow-up to the points that you both just made, which is this counter-majoritarian move by the Republicans, which I think is really an interesting frame, just to say that if you can't win on ideas, then you have to stop people from voting. And we've had, Republican office holders and campaign folks say that pretty explicitly. And we're coming up to an election where the whole terms of voting are going to be very different than they've been in the past, because we're going to be voting in the middle of a massive public health crisis. But in some ways, isn't this counter-majoritarian shift, I think, Paul, you just said this, maybe elaborating on or asking you to elaborate a little bit, is a good sign. I mean, it's a sign that they really can't hold on, that the politics, the dilemma that you all point out in the book, has basically become unsustainable. So you can't, even with the outrage stoking and with the race baiting and the weaponization of race, it's not enough to maintain the plutocratic thing. So you have to now actually, put up roadblocks and obstacles to ordinary people voting. So is that a good sign?
Well, it's a tell. To put it in the language of poker, I think it's highly revealing. I don't know whether I would say it's a good sign, there's, as Jacob was starting to say, I think, one thing that we're trying to do in this book, so the first sentence of the book is, despite the title, is this is not a book about Donald Trump, right? We attempt to zoom out a little bit and look at the big picture, and crucial elements of the big picture associated with democracy trying to function in a context of extreme inequality. There are key structural features that you're likely to see in that context. And again, Daniel Ziblatt in his really quite wonderful book, sees this in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he says, well, what's the Conservative Party going to do in that context? Well, there are two things that they're likely to do if they don't moderate on economic issues. One is they're going to work with surrogate groups to generate a kind of identity politics, right? To pull things away from a focus on economics. And the other thing that they're likely to do is to try to rig the system, right? So this was, these issues have existed as long as there's been democracy and inequality struggling to coincide. There is I'm again, with Jacob, I'm optimistic about the long run if we can get to the long run, because I don't think that these are viable long-term strategies. But I'm extremely worried about the short run. I'm worried about November. It is we could get into talking about vote by mail and the post office. I mean, the effort to gut the post office, again, a very popular institution that they're gutting. I mean, most voters don't realize that they're doing that, but it's an astonishing thing for for an elected government to try to do these kinds of things. But it's quite dangerous. It's quite dangerous. I do think that we're in this fraught moment. And one thing maybe I'll just bring out a little bit more at this point about this counter-majoritarian idea is there's been actually a lot of discussion about the erosion of democracy and the potential for an erosion of democracy in the United States. A lot of it being generated by Ziblatt's other wonderful book, which he wrote with Steve Levitsky, How Democracies Die, right? Which was written by these two people who have looked at the breakdown of democracy in other countries and see really important lessons for the United States today, all right? And so they describe what political scientists call democratic backsliding, which is sort of like slipping into authoritarianism. And we think that there's lots of reason to worry about democratic backsliding in the US, and certainly lots of authoritarian actions coming out of the administration and some of its allies, and a lot of that happening at the state level in particular. But we also think that there is this other danger, which is of counter-majoritarianism. I actually think in retrospect, maybe minoritarianism would have been a better phrase for us to use, because people will often say, rightly so, that, well, the Constitution was designed to be counter-majoritarian. It didn't want to let, Madison didn't want to let majorities just run roughshod over minorities, right? So there were lots of protections built into the system for political minorities, and that's true. But what we're witnessing, and this is really unprecedented, is a system where all the biases of representation play to the advantage of one political party, which in many ways is the minority party in the country right now, right? Republicans have lost the popular vote in 6 out of the last 7 presidential elections. And yet they've been able to appoint a majority on the Supreme Court, right? They usually don't get the majority of the vote in Senate elections, but they have a majority in the Senate. They almost never get the majority in congressional elections, House elections, but they've often had a majority in House elections because of gerrymandering and because their voters are more favorably distributed across districts than Democrats are, who are often crowded in cities, right? So you have the possibility, Jamel Boole had a nice op-ed about this the other day in the New York Times. You have the possibility, not just of minorities blocking majorities, but of minorities, numerical minorities, rural whites, right, governing over majorities, right? Because of the biases in the political system and the ways in which they've been able to entrench and intensify some of those biases. And that's obviously deeply, deeply troubling.
Jacob, anything to add?
Don't forget the Electoral College. That's another one that has been, again, Paul said that 6 of the last 7, but 6 of the last 7 presidential elections the popular vote's been won by Democrats. But of course, as everyone knows, in two of those, the Republican candidate actually gained the presidency through the Electoral College. And there was this chilling finding of a National Bureau of Economic Research paper that found that if elections are close in the future, they're overwhelmingly going to favor the Republican Party through the Electoral College. So, I think we want to be optimistic. We just want to be realistic as well. And white ethno-nationalist populism is not a long-term majoritarian strategy, as we say in the book. That's just a question of math. But whether or not Republicans have to moderate on economics and become a multiracial party is a question of politics, right? And it's a question of politics because we could see them, on the one hand, see them bend to the will of majorities and bend to democratic politics, but we could also see them bend democratic politics, making it more and more undemocratic by pursuing these kind of minoritarian moves.
All right. Sobering, for sure. So this is the last question, and I think it's pretty open-ended, but this is maybe a service to our listeners. The question is, what kind of language and framing should we be using to educate and persuade people on these complex issues and shift the narrative? So we want your advice on how do we talk about this going forward at this important and fraught moment in history.
Now, that's a tough question, because I would say Paul and I, we there's that famous Clint Eastwood line, a man's got to know his limits. I can't believe I'm quoting Clint Eastwood, but a man's got to know his limits. And I have to be honest that, thinking about the rhetoric and framing that are most effective is not our top, skill. But I do think a major conclusion of the book is that the Democratic Party needs to really focus, I think, on coming up with an economic agenda of the sort that the Economic Policy Institute has so ably outlined, that really is a multiracial economic agenda for the middle and working classes, right? Because that actually turns out to be, on economic issues, a strong majority position. And the second thing I think that we would emphasize, and that I did emphasize earlier, is the ways in which, for Americans, the way in which inequality is distorting our politics and leading to this kind of division, including racial division, is their greatest concern about the effect of inequality. And it is really fundamental to rebuild. It's really fundamental that we rebuild trust in government, trust in our political leaders, and a sense that we have the capacity, which in too many cases we don't have, to tackle the pressing problems in their lives. So I think that's got to be where we begin.
Paul?
I'll just say, like Jacob, we are economic populists. We believe that is the direction that the party should go. We think these policies are popular. That's probably pleasing to the ears of much of the audience for this conversation, I would imagine. There is one place where we're maybe somewhat more hesitant than others would be, and it connects to what we were saying before about American political institutions. Democrats have to build a bigger tent than Republicans do, given the nature of electoral geography, given the decisive voter for control of the Senate, for the Electoral College, even for the House of Representatives, is to the right of the median voter within the country as a whole. And so the Democratic Party, to succeed electorally, needs to be a bigger tent. And it needs to recognize and take seriously the possibility for divisions within the coalition that it's trying to build. And some work that Jacob and I are pursuing now, we're exploring in particular the opportunities, but also the potential danger areas for building a coalition between urban and suburban America, which we think is vital to both establishing broad economic prosperity and as well as political stability in the country, but where there are real tensions between urban and suburban voters that opponents can potentially exploit. But to end on an upbeat and economically populist note, one thing that we would emphasize in thinking about how Democrats should navigate that would be that the only silver lining in the intense winner-take inequality that the United States has produced in the last 40 years is that you actually really can think about providing very broad benefits to ordinary Americans based largely on taxing people way, way up at the top, right? And that's very popular, and it would actually both ease a lot of the tensions within this nascent Democratic coalition potentially, right? Because you don't have a situation where you're heavily taxing, suburban professionals in order to finance benefits for the urban poor or something like that. But it also, it just creates an opportunity in which, and I think it is vital for any successful coalition to do this, where after the dust is settled on the election, you deliver important improvements in the quality of lives, right? For the people who have supported you and also for the people who haven't supported you. But you're hoping somewhere down the road, because it's going to be a while, I think it's going to be a while before rural America is open in a serious way to hearing big appeals from Democrats. Like, you can make inroads there. But I think that, white identity is pretty built up and pretty built in a lot of those communities. And that's not something that's going to change overnight, right? But the way you start moving things in the right direction is by delivering things that actually are going to improve people's lives.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jacob and Paul. And Larry and Jaimie, and all of you for coming and joining us this afternoon. I think that this was an extraordinarily interesting and useful conversation. And Jacob, maybe you undersell yourselves, because I think everybody should go buy your book, because it really does provide a lot of, I think what it does is a confidence builder for those of us who have supported these progressive economic policies, that we aren't crazy. That, in fact, we are representing what a vast majority of Americans do want. But there have been, from a lot of chicanery and the ways in which the political system has been rigged and controlled by plutocrats, by very wealthy folks. And I think it's also, there's important information in here for Democrats, that some of the questions in the Q&A box were about corporate Democrats, and I think you all talked about that earlier too, that the Democratic Party also has choices to make in terms of really knowing who the base is and who are the people who have been neglected and left behind, and what kind of policies we need to look at going forward to build that really robust and winning coalition, and then we can fix, hopefully we can fix campaign finance reform, we can fix the democratic system to make sure that we really have the ability to have a full and healthy democracy. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to all of you who were with us, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.